How about this poor thing? I've eliminated the smell of poverty for you. Jan uttered these words with such contempt that the air around him seemed to freeze with cold. I stood in front of him, still not believing that this was happening, that the person with whom I was supposed to connect my life could say something so humiliating. Champagne splashed violently in my face, droplets of spray settled on my hair and dress, as a symbol of destroyed pride. It happened at the most inopportune moment, when I was trying to greet my fiancé's family. And what did Jan do? He just laughed out loud, as if it was the funniest episode of the evening. His laughter rang out in the hall crowded with guests, and every sound echoed in my mind, making this scene even more unbearable. I glanced back at his mother, Emily Young, who was still clutching an empty glass, her eyes shining with predatory satisfaction. This moment, this humiliating laugh, it was all set up. They were playing for the audience, having fun at my expense. The carefully arranged hair, the dress chosen with such attention, everything seemed unnecessary now. I was deceived, as were my hopes for a future with this man. Not only did Jan not care about me, he did it pointedly. His indifference was as sharp as a knife. And then, at that very moment, when the emptiness filled me completely, I realized, there is no point in this game anymore. I'm canceling our contract, I said calmly, but my words came out of the blue. Everyone in the hall fell silent, and even Jan stopped laughing. Emily Young, the same woman who had been the epitome of arrogance just moments ago, was stunned. Ian was also looking at me with the same expression of shock, as if he couldn't believe that someone would dare to challenge his family. "What did you say?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. But I already knew that there would be no questions, no explanations. I repeated my words again, but more quietly, as if it were a simple statement of fact. I'm canceling our contract. This contract, concluded not only for the sake of marriage, but also for the sake of future cooperation between our companies, has now become meaningless. My responsibilities to their son were destroyed the moment I realized that this family saw me as just a means to achieve their goals, nothing more. While I was leaving this cold house, Emily, still unable to utter a word, remained standing behind, and Ian looked at me as if at something incomprehensible. They were confused, they didn't understand how it all happened so suddenly. I could feel their confusion, but it was already clear to me. My name is Tana Brunn. I'm 48 years old, and I've never been married in my life. I always appreciate my loneliness, my freedom, devoting all my time to work and enjoying quiet evenings with a book or a movie. I lived like this, without much regret, until the day when an unexpected marriage proposal changed everything. This offer came in the spring, when the flowers were just beginning to bloom, and the world around looked as fresh and refreshed as life itself. Douglas Goldman, an old business partner, introduced me to his youngest son, Jan. "I have one request, if you don't mind," Jan said, his voice soft, almost hesitant, when he first addressed me in that tone. It was our first meeting, everything was conditional and a little formal. But from the very beginning, he seemed to me to be polite and friendly, a man who knows how to win over himself. I remember thinking at that moment, maybe this is the person I could spend my life with. Jan was not like the other men I had met before. There was something else about him, elusive, that attracted me. And although my heart had long been accustomed to loneliness, to the quiet world that I had created around me, the idea of marrying Jan no longer seemed impossible to me. So, I suggested that we start dating. President Goldman, his father, seemed very pleased with this decision. Jan also accepted the offer with visible pleasure. Everything started smoothly. We spent time together, got to know each other, and I started to think that maybe I had made the right choice. But 5 weeks into our relationship, everything changed. On the third date, Ian was again the polite but slightly distant person I was used to seeing. We met in a small but elegant setting. He put on a casual jacket, his image was relaxed and youthful, as if he was trying to erase the age boundaries between us. I also changed my style, Strict suits and elegant dresses have gone, trousers and a more relaxed look have taken their place. We both tried to make our meetings easier, fresher, like young people, although each of us knew that we already had our own story behind us. But during this date, I suddenly felt something strange in his behavior. He started making comments that sounded condescending, like I was new to his world. He took me to a rather expensive restaurant, and noticed with a slight pride. "You don't usually go to places like this, do you? This must be unusual for you." His words hit me like an unexpected slap in the face. My lips curved into an ambiguous smile, and I pretended that his comment didn't bother me. In fact, this restaurant was one of my favorites. 3 days ago, I had dinner here with a friend, but decided not to tell Jan about it. It would be cruel to embarrass him on the spot. The waiter, whom I knew by name, only nodded, understanding my silent signal, and pretended to see me for the first time. We sat down at the table. Jan started talking about expensive things again, and then his watch caught my attention. They weren't the most expensive, but they still looked decent. I complimented him. "This watch suits you, the color is very beautiful." Jan was visibly embarrassed, but at the same time flattered. He took them off his wrist to show me closer. It was a gesture of kindness, although I wasn't particularly interested in studying his watch. I glanced at them briefly and immediately returned them. But Jan seems to have misunderstood my interest. He offered them to me again, saying with a smile, "Don't be shy, take a closer look. It's not every day you see a watch like this, is it?" My feelings were mixed. His persistence was unnecessary, but I didn't want to offend him. Holding back my bewilderment, I accepted the watch, although I really had no interest in men's accessories. Jan insisted, and I reluctantly agreed to watch it again, trying to be polite. However, deep down, I already felt that a vague anxiety was beginning to arise between us, as if the threads that bound us at first were gradually weakening. A watch is just an accessory, I thought, looking at it, and nowadays it's enough to check the time on a smartphone. However, I mentioned Jan's watch only casually, as if it were a passing compliment, just as one might praise a new decorative item in a friend's house. Many of the older people I work with also wear similar watches, so it wasn't something extraordinary for me. "Thanks for showing them," I added, trying to make the conversation easy and not overload it with meaning. "It's always nice to have something that brings joy." Jan pouted slightly, his gaze fixed on my things, examining them with the same excellent tone inherent in him. His quiet disappointment caught my attention. He focused on my bag, the one I loved so much. It was a special piece, created especially for me in my favorite workshop. It not only reflected my sense of style, but also the skill of its creator. This bag was not only aesthetic, but also practical, and although it cost a lot, for me its value was not in the price. However, Jan seemed to see her differently. "Don't you have a more suitable bag?" "What is it?" he asked with a slight hint of reproach. "I think you should buy something more prestigious." I was confused for a moment. The bag was custom-made in one of the best Italian workshops, and it did not have a prominent logo on it, which I thought confused January. In fact, the logo was hidden at the bottom, according to my own wish. I always preferred a concise and simple design. But for a person who is not used to women's accessories, it would be difficult to judge the value of a thing just by looking at it. "The logo doesn't always speak about quality," I added quietly, feeling an inner sense of discomfort slowly build up. His consistently excellent tone began to bore me. Sometimes I turned a blind eye to it, accepting it as the result of the upbringing of a man who grew up in a world of protected wealth and never knew real life. But with each date, this feeling intensified. Ian was indeed a kind and honest man, but his childish immaturity in the relationship was striking. This feeling caught up with me again on the 5th date, when we went to the famous hotel buffet. That evening, everything went as usual, but soon I noticed that Jan was putting portions of food on his plate with some unnatural zeal, 3 or 4 portions at once, although he clearly did not intend to eat it all. Are you sure it's worth taking so much? I asked cautiously, watching him load the plate. It would be a waste if you can't eat everything. Ian just chuckled, as if my question was somehow stupid. I'll finish everything, don't worry, he said lightly, but when he noticed my expression, he suddenly laughed. What's so funny? I asked, feeling that he seemed to find something funny in my words. But his answer stunned me. It's a waste, Tana, he said, still smiling. You still sound like a poor man. It's okay if I take so much food. It doesn't matter if I don't eat everything, because I can afford to throw away what I can't finish. I felt a shadow of annoyance cross my face. His words made me shudder. Jan did not understand at all that spending food is not just a matter of money. It was about respect for other people and for the resources that were used to cook this food. It's not just about the money, I said, trying to keep my voice down. It's also about resources and respect for others. Don't you realize that throwing away food is disrespectful? Jan suddenly froze, poking at the pasta with a fork. Something like embarrassment flashed in his eyes. I'm sorry, he muttered, looking down at his plate. Don't be angry, please. His reaction was unexpected, but even more unexpected was that he suddenly mentioned his mother. My mom said you might only marry me for the money. His voice was low, almost apologetic. I just reacted without thinking. The word mom hung in the air. I involuntarily repeated it to myself, trying to figure out what this sudden turn in the conversation meant. The mention of his mother seemed strange, but apparently she played some important role in his life and his perception of relationships. Mindful of this discomfort, Jan drove me home, and when I was about to get out of the car, he suddenly grabbed my hand. His voice was serious, but there was a note of excitement in it. Although I am who I am, would you agree to marry me, even if it would be a while? Engagement is fine, I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. These words stunned me. Jan, usually so indecisive and timid, suddenly showed amazing assertiveness. I froze, momentarily unable to respond, but when his sincerity reached me, I felt a wave of joy. Is he really that serious? Despite all the disturbing aspects that I noticed in his behavior, his courtship brought me sincere pleasure. Maybe those moments that raised doubts in me can be improved over time. I thought. Love is not always perfect from the very beginning. Perhaps after the wedding, I can help him become a better husband, loving and understanding. It's been 3 months since we started dating, and I felt it was the right time to move forward. Let's grow up together, I said, fighting back tears. Complimenting each other, discussing and solving our differences. We're both not perfect, but we can get better together. My words were full of emotion, but at the very moment when I agreed to his proposal, Jan again showed the traits that worried me. Okay, let's start preparing for family life, he said with a big smile. You will need to quit your job, take care of the house and learn housekeeping from my mom. His words hit me like an icy wind. The joy instantly evaporated, giving way to anger, which slowly rose in me. How could he be so arrogant? Does he really think that I will just give up my career, my dreams and ambitions to become a housewife, obeying his mother's rules? Don't be so cocky, Jan, I replied, more sharply than usual. If that's what you think, then marriage is out of the question. Jan was stunned, not expecting such a turn. He was silent, looking at me in confusion, and I, overcome with anger and disappointment, got out of the car and, without looking back, headed for my house. Despite my decision to distance myself, I couldn't completely cut off contact. When a few days later I received a message from Jan asking me to meet and talk, I reluctantly agreed. The weekend passed quickly, and now the day of our meeting has come. Jan was already waiting for me when I arrived at the place where we agreed to meet. As soon as I appeared on the horizon, he hurriedly stood up and, before I could say anything, deeply apologized. "I'm sorry," he said with sincerity in his voice. "I was stupid last time. My friends told me to set the rules from the beginning, and I took it too seriously. They even scolded me for it." Ian sighed. His energy was clearly running out. His confession, albeit somewhat clumsy, gradually melted my anger. I couldn't help but notice how genuinely worried he was about what had happened. I wanted to click my tongue in annoyance, but looking at his sincere eyes, I softened. It was disappointing, but at the same time, Ian was dear to me. He was straightforward, sometimes too much, and often did not distinguish between the joke and the seriousness. He was easily influenced by others, which made him somewhat indecisive, but there was an honesty in him that touched me. No one is perfect from the very beginning, I reminded myself. We need to be patient. In the end, we reconciled and got engaged. Ian looked up at me when I said that, and his face lit up, as if the clouds had finally parted. It's been a month since we became officially engaged. It's time to meet with the families to discuss the upcoming wedding. The first meeting was to take place at the house of the Young family. Although I had known President Goldman for a long time and maintained an exceptionally professional relationship with him, this was my first visit to his house, and I was a little nervous. Jan also seemed to have been out of his mind since the morning of our visit. He was as gentle and sweet as ever, but his nervousness didn't escape my gaze. About my mom," he began cautiously. I tried to collect my thoughts, preparing for possible disagreements that could arise between the future daughter-in-law and mother-in-law. But I tried not to attach too much importance to it. I believed in his mother, who was known as a hard-working woman and the kind-hearted wife of President Goldman. I hoped that if I spoke sincerely, they would understand me, but as it turned out, I was mistaken. As soon as I entered the room where we were supposed to be greeted, I didn't have time to look around as a cold liquid splashed into my face. My eyes immediately ached from a strong burning sensation. A sharp, pungent smell hit my nose, making me cough. In a panic, I tried to wipe my face. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hardly understand what was happening. And suddenly a mocking voice cut through the air. "Well, how do you like it, poor thing?" "I got rid of the unpleasant smell, so be grateful," the woman said with undisguised contempt. I looked around in horror and finally realized that the champagne had burned my lips and eyes. But why? Why did Jan's mother, Emily, his future mother-in-law, do this? President Goldman, standing next to me, seemed as stunned as I was. "Emily, what are you doing?" he exclaimed in complete disbelief, but that only seemed to encourage her. Emily laughed and spoke again. Her tone was venomous. What happened, Tana? You're all wet." "How funny, isn't it, Jan?" "Typical of you, Mommy," Jan chimed in, bursting into loud laughter that echoed through the room. I couldn't believe what was happening. Everything that had happened before, our conversations, meetings, even moments of joy, suddenly lost all meaning. An emptiness accumulated in my heart, eclipsing all the feelings I had for January. At that moment, I realized that there could be no further joint plans with this family. "I'm terminating our contract with your company," I suddenly burst out of my mouth. Jan and Emily turned to me at once, their faces full of surprise. They looked at each other hastily and began to whisper, obviously discussing my words. Perhaps they were thinking about our business relationship, or perhaps about how to get out of this awkward situation now. I felt like an outsider, not participating in their conversation. However, there was one person who remained silent. It was President Goldman. He stood there without saying a word, his face pale, his eyes wide open. I turned to him and started talking with the same politeness that had always been between us. "President Goldman," I said quietly, "I want to thank you for your cooperation over the years. I appreciate everything you've done for us. However, the terms of our agreement implied that such an incident would not happen." I paused, trying to contain the emotions that were bubbling inside me. Then I turned to Emily and Jan, who continued to watch me with uncertainty. Jan was clearly trying to capture his mother's mood, but he also seemed confused. One of the conditions of my consent to this marriage was that I would not disclose my position until the final decision on the wedding was made, I continued. I understood that my profession could affect the perception of me in your family, and I wanted Jan to be evaluated not for my connections or business successes, but for my personal qualities. I slowly took a business card out of my purse and handed it to Emily. It said the name of my company and my position was president. Jan paled even more when he saw the name of the company. Working for his father's company, he couldn't help but realize how important my role was to their business. My name may have been unknown to the general public, but it carried weight in business circles. I am the owner of a company that is one of the largest partners in your husband's business. We have been working together for more than 10 years, and I am proud that I have achieved this through my efforts. My company is probably your most important customer right now, I said, looking straight into Emily's eyes. I felt her confidence falter. Ian stood nearby, looking completely stunned. He probably did not expect that the woman he considered poor would turn out to be one of the key players in his father's business. Therefore, I continued, making the last chord in my speech. I wanted my profession to remain a secret until the decision on marriage was made. I wanted to see what was more important, money or love. I want to see a real person, not just superficial behavior, I said, looking straight into Jan's eyes. I can't afford a far-fetched attitude, because it can affect not only our personal lives, but also the fate of our companies. Sighing, I remembered how it all started. I was introduced as a simple person you met at work, I continued. This was only part of my plan. I wore fake glasses, changed my makeup and hairstyle to hide my identity. At one point, it even seemed funny. But now, looking back, I realized that it was a waste of time. My disguise was just a surface, an attempt to avoid bias. But now is the moment to tell the truth. I'm sorry, President Goldman, I said to his pale face, but I have to decline this offer, both in terms of marriage and in terms of our business dealings. We are suspending cooperation in order to reassess the situation. President Goldman stuttered, his hands were shaking. He understood that my words meant not only the end of personal relations with Ian, but also a serious blow to their business. But it can't affect our transactions, he finally managed, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and helplessness. His reaction seemed forced, as if he was trying to save face in front of his wife and son. I shook my head, indicating that my decision was final. My words are not based on emotions, I continued calmly. President Goldman, you have already mentioned that you plan to retire soon and transfer the management of the company to January. In such a situation, it would be wise for us to reconsider how reliable a partner your son will be. There was a tense silence in the room. Emily, Jan, and President Goldman listened with growing concern. For a long time, I believed that our union was an opportunity to strengthen not only our personal relations, but also our business ones. However, unfortunately, all this has led to the opposite results. Right after graduating from university, I started my own company with friends. More than 20 years have passed, and all this time I have been running the business as its president. I paused, letting my words settle in the air. We've been working with your company for over 10 years, I continued. My leadership, based on a female point of view, has brought my company recognition for its unique approach to doing business. Our deals with your company have been mutually beneficial, and both companies have grown. However, recently discussions have begun in our team, whether to continue cooperation with you or start looking for new partners. Jan turned even paler, unable to believe what he had heard. Until that moment, he had never thought about the state of their company, and he did not know about the problems in management at all. Emily, on the other hand, was clearly worried. What does this mean? What is it? She asked, shaking President Goldman's hand. Panic was reflected on her face, and her voice was saturated with fear. President Goldman nervously wiped the sweat from his forehead. His face betrayed concern, as if he had just learned about a serious diagnosis that was not discussed in the family circle. I turned my gaze to Jan, who clearly did not understand the full depth of what was happening. Your company, I began quietly, has been facing serious management difficulties in recent months. I've heard that contracts with some of your other partners are about to expire, and new deals are not visible on the horizon. Information about your situation is critical for making further decisions. Emily squeezed the president's hand even harder, her eyes flashing with horror and anger. Problems? What problems are you talking about? Ian finally spoke up, confused. Jan, I said, looking him straight in the eye, you don't seem to understand the state of the company you're supposed to run. I wanted to evaluate you as a partner not only in life, but also in business. Now, having seen your behavior, I have to admit that our paths diverge. Jan was silent. President Goldman, trying to keep the remnants of control over the situation, strongly suggested that I meet with January. His voice sounded confident, but there was the weariness of a man who realizes that the situation is getting out of control. He clearly didn't expect things to go this far. Jan, your actions have brought us to this moment, he said, looking at his son. Perhaps the marriage proposal was conceived in order to maintain the stability of our company. But it looks like you're willing to do anything to keep our business relationship going at all costs. Jan, pale and confused, just stared at his father in silence, clutching his mother's hand tightly, as if looking for comfort in it. Emily, visibly trembling, could no longer contain her emotions. Her lips were trembling slightly, and she could barely utter a word while I calmly and coolly explained to President Goldman what management problems their company was facing. Your company, Emily, is facing much more serious problems than you probably realize. Previously, it was praised for the quality and speed of deliveries, but now competitors have technologically bypassed you. You are no longer offering anything that would set you apart in the market. Your production processes are outdated, development has slowed down, and cost reduction is barely progressing. Products have become expensive, and given the unacceptable level of pressure on employees, your delivery times are shortened, which further spoils your reputation. My words hung in the air. The room became noticeably colder, as if the truth that they had ignored for so long had finally made itself felt. Ian swallowed nervously, and Emily glared at me, her trembling hands barely holding the remnants of her composure. Switching to products from a company with such a low rating as yours can cause a domino effect, destroying the reputation of all your partners. Even companies with a long history may face problems due to outdated structures and high staff turnover. Your company's market share, President Goldman, is gradually declining, and its efficiency continues to decline. Emily couldn't stand it and, clenching her teeth, cried out, "How dare you threaten to shut down a business based on personal feelings? This is a despicable act. You're blackmailing us. Do not think that this behavior is acceptable." Her words cut through the silence like a knife. I could have expected such a reaction, but I was still surprised at how sharply and aggressively she behaved. No apologies for his behavior, no regrets, just accusations and anger. Before I could answer, President Goldman interrupted her scream with a furious yell. "Silence. It's all your fault." His voice boomed in the room, and Emily froze as if she had been showered with ice. I swallowed the words I was going to say. It was obvious that President Goldman was aware of how devastating the consequences of his wife's thoughtless actions could be. "My decision, President Goldman, has nothing to do with personal feelings," I said, looking at January. "I really hoped that an alliance with your family could bring stability to our business relations. However, now I see that I was wrong." Jan stood by, pale and trembling, clutching his mother's hand like a small child seeking protection. He was already 48 years old, and yet he seemed unable to cope with the situation, needing the support of Emily, who was shaking with worry herself. The sight of his pitiful condition was almost painful. How can you, with such a cheap-looking bag, be the president of the company? Jan suddenly shouted, apparently trying to save at least a drop of his dignity. You complain about food waste, you act like you're poor. You're even lying about being my father's business partner. How shameful it is. He fiercely accused me, trying to turn his attention to me, but his words only emphasized his own powerlessness and insecurity. I answered calmly, without letting myself be confused. I am not interested in branded things, January. I prefer high-quality products of domestic production. And my leather accessories are no exception. This bag is custom-made in a small workshop that I often visit. Anyone who understands the quality of the skin would recognize it instantly. But you don't seem to be interested. I paused, feeling Ian clench his fists in frustration. This bag is more expensive than many of the commercial brands that you praise so much. And as for the food, I criticize not because I am poor, but because wasting food is unacceptable behavior. I kept talking, trying to keep my composure despite the internal tension. Emily, suddenly noticing my shoes and bag, only glanced at them briefly and quickly looked away. Obviously, her embarrassment was caused not so much by the things themselves, but by the fact that they were in conflict with her preconceived ideas about me. I saw her blush slightly. She realized that she had made a mistake in her judgment, but there was nothing she could do about it. No wonder you don't finish everything, I continued. This is not only wasteful, but also disrespectful to the restaurant and its staff. Ordering more food than you can eat is unwise behavior. And, Ian, in case you're still in doubt, I confirm that I am indeed your father's business partner. But does it really matter if the presidents of companies themselves cannot realize who they are doing business with? Jan seemed annoyed and not too convinced by my words. His displeased face betrayed a clear resistance to everything that was happening, although he seemed to have no arguments left. President Goldman frowned at his son's behavior, clearly unhappy that Jan was showing such immaturity at such an important moment. When it became obvious that our relationship was based on knowledge of each other and mutual understanding, Ian looked down. He remained silent, hiding behind his mother's back like a child, not a grown man. This scene caused me deep disappointment. His behavior was so childish and inappropriate for a man of his age that I couldn't help but wonder how wrong I had been in my past judgments about him. My faith in his honesty and hope for an improvement in our relationship crumbled before my eyes. He just clung to his mother, unable to take responsibility for his life or for the actions of the company. If your company leaves us, we will be on the verge of bankruptcy. President Goldman suddenly broke the silence, and his voice trembled with tension. Please forgive us. These words struck with unexpected force. I saw the gravity of the situation finally sink in for Emily. Her face paled, and she could no longer hide her shock. Jan, standing next to her, also turned pale, and his trembling increased. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he, choked with despair, whispered, "Mom." His voice was full of pain and fear, and he gripped his mother's hand even tighter, as if he was afraid of losing the last support in his life. However, Emily did not respond. Her face was frozen in mute horror. She could no longer deny the consequences of her actions. Watching the scene, I involuntarily sighed, as if all the weight that I carried in my heart had finally become lighter. The relief I felt was deep and sincere. I suddenly realized how happy I was that I would not have to share my life with a man who turned out to be so weak and dependent on his mother. My past naive belief that I could change him, that he would succumb to my influence, now seemed like a ridiculous fantasy. "I'm sorry," President Goldman repeated again, his apologies sounding like endless pleas, although they did not contain suggestions on how to fix the situation. This hesitant behavior only strengthened my resolute attitude. I understood that such emotional moments can destroy any business relationship if you do not take clear steps. I looked directly at President Goldman and said firmly, let's talk about our engagement. I can't afford to marry a man whose mother is being so rude. Moreover, Young himself never tried to stop her and even laughed with her at the situation. I hope you understand why this engagement should be cancelled. President Goldman listened to me with a face full of humility and understanding. He nodded quietly in agreement, and I continued. Until yesterday, I still believed in Jan's potential, believed that over time he could change, become better. I tried to keep our engagement going, despite my doubts. But now I feel incredibly relieved that our relationship has broken up. I gave several examples of Jan's behavior that only confirmed my disappointment. His frequent appeal to his mother's opinion was one of them. Jan was constantly talking, that's what Mom said. Another thing that struck me was the way he called his mother Mommy, even at almost 50 years old. He used her opinion as a shield to justify his mistakes, but every time I pointed out his weaknesses, he quickly became discouraged. There were countless similar examples, and they only strengthened my confidence in the correctness of my decision. President Goldman was amazed, his face frozen in a stunned expression, and his mouth opened in surprise. Even Emily looked confused as she realized how deep-rooted the problems were in their family. But Jan himself didn't seem to understand what exactly was problematic about his behavior. Is there any mistake on my part? I finally asked with cold calmness. President Goldman shook his head quietly. His pathetic appearance only confirmed my opinion. I paused to collect my thoughts and took another deep breath. I'm divorcing my wife, President Goldman suddenly announced, his voice sounding resolute but anxious. Jan will have to leave with her too. The company's activities will be taken over by competent staff. Please don't leave us. Help us. His sudden statement was so unexpected that I was taken aback for a moment. Emily screamed, stunned by President Goldman's words. Her face contorted with indignation, she spasmodically looked back at Jan, and their protests instantly filled the room. Jan, desperately clenching his hands into fists, cried out. Why didn't you tell us about this in advance? It's not my fault. Why am I being kicked out too? The only problem is with Mom, I'm not involved at all. Their simultaneous screams merged into a cacophony, which caused the atmosphere to heat up to the limit. The room was filled with a chaotic noise of accusations, excuses, and bewilderment. I stood on the sidelines, watching this outbreak of family drama, like a bystander to the crash. It was clear that each of them was trying to escape from the impending collapse, but no one wanted to take responsibility for what had already happened. I didn't care anymore. I finally sighed heavily, as if I had thrown off the last shackles, and looking straight into the eyes of President Goldman, I said quietly but firmly, As you wish. Thank you for your time. I'm leaving. With that, I headed for the exit, feeling the anxiety that had been weighing on me for all these months gradually recede. Leaving this farce behind me, I only mentally noted that I need to immediately take care of my clothes. Stains from champagne spilled in the midst of the conflict can ruin it completely if I do not send things to the dry cleaner as soon as possible. Jan stopped protesting, and suddenly tears glistened in his eyes. His face turned pale, and he seemed to accept what was happening. All he could do was cry, helplessly clinging to the last remnants of his former world. Emily, despite her attempts to object, was quickly put down by President Goldman's stern tone. But even after his harsh reprimand, she continued to clench her teeth, clearly unhappy, but at the same time realizing that the situation was out of control. Her determination still seemed stronger than that of her son, who had completely lost all confidence. It's been 5 months since that moment. That day, full of tension and helplessness, was left behind, but its consequences were more than palpable for the entire Goldman family. As predicted, President Goldman has resigned. This was not an ordinary retirement. He voluntarily took responsibility for the deterioration of the company's performance. The main reason for this crisis was the termination of the contract with our company. The step I took then left a deep mark on the entire structure of their business. After his departure, Goldman's former subordinate took over the management of the company. The new president, being a determined and methodical man, quickly put things in order. He conducted a comprehensive analysis of all operations, taking the company out of family control. This step was met with approval both within the company and in the foreign market, which led to a significant improvement in its reputation. He was actively involved in the development of new products, and the results were not long in coming. A new era of renaissance has begun, and perhaps our interrupted cooperation could be restored in the future. Meanwhile, there have been changes in President Goldman's personal life. Key and Emily have officially divorced. Ian left with her, as expected, and they began a life together. However, rumors of daily conflicts between them spread quickly. The once close relationship between mother and son has now become clearly strained. Their foundation, financial comfort, has disintegrated along with the loss of influence and status. After Yang was excluded from the business, financial dependence on his mother quickly led them to collapse. Emily couldn't stand the pressure. Unable to cope with the loss of her former luxurious life, she left Jan and disappeared. Now, according to rumors, she lived alone in an old cheap apartment, mourning her fate. Her once arrogant behavior, wasteful lifestyle, and inability to take responsibility for her actions led her to complete loneliness. She no longer had any helpers or friends, and those who once surrounded her had long since turned away. About a year after President Goldman's resignation, I met him by chance when I went into their former company. It was an unexpected meeting. He looked exhausted, but there was still a certain pride on his face, although his eyes betrayed fatigue. "I'm sorry for all the inconvenience," he began, clearly feeling a heavy sense of guilt. He told me that he generously gave Emily half of his estate after the divorce. But, as it turned out, her financial problems were not limited to this. Yang continued to make demands on her, and her exorbitant spending only made the situation worse. All this has turned her life into financial chaos. Unfortunately, as the former president said, it was all the result of Emily's personal responsibility and her inability to change. Initially, I planned to keep Ian at a distance, avoiding deep interactions with him, as if his presence could infect me with the remnants of my old life. However, when I found out that his almost 50-year-old son does not even know how to boil water, my heart was filled with compassion and anxiety. I couldn't let him stay like this. Eventually, Jan and I started living together. I felt that this was the only way to help him learn how to take care of himself by making various household decisions. I shared little things with him every day: how to cook eggs properly, how to take care of clothes, how to organize your space properly. Ian was completely dependent on Emily, and his complete helplessness alarmed me. With each passing day, I realized how much I didn't take proper care of my family myself. Awareness was growing inside me. This is a misfortune that I created myself, and now I had to pay for my mistakes. Whenever I was alone with my thoughts, they turned out to be dark and heavy. I thought that maybe I had done something bad to Emily too, leaving her without support. I didn't want to admit to myself that all this drama was the result of my inept game with fate. Fortunately, my company did not go bankrupt, and I was relieved when President Goldman retired. Now, sitting at home, he is seriously engaged in his son for the first time, spending time with him and trying to make his life at least a little better. Jan is facing unprecedented challenges. Running a household and finding a side job, despite his age, are proving to be a real challenge for him. Often, when I accidentally see him, he finds himself in tears, sitting on the couch, as if his hopes and dreams have crumbled before his eyes. I can only hope that he will one day become a decent man, but I myself would not like to deal with him anymore. 3 years have passed since then. Things are going very well in my company. The indicators have improved compared to previous periods, and the share price has also increased. The personal situation has also changed. I am no longer considering marriage and have already informed my parents that when I got engaged and how they supported my decision to remain single after the engagement was terminated. I explained all the details to them, and fortunately they did not approve of my involvement in the lives of Emily and her son. It gave me the opportunity to focus on my work. My parents have become even more supportive of my dedication. In recent months, I have been actively working and finding new hobbies, striving to lead a more fulfilling life. I used to prefer indoor classes, but now I decided to do sports in the gym. Every time I look at my reflection in the mirror, I see how muscles begin to form, and I feel how my subordinates look at me with admiration. It's a pretty ticklish feeling when others start to see you as the result of work, when they notice how you're changing. I've always believed that happiness is something you create for yourself. Now I was looking for him in my successes, in my efforts, and not just in what comes with others. If I had to fall in love with life again, I would prefer it to happen towards the end of my journey, when I can look at life with full awareness. I feel like I can afford to give up everything for love, but that's not my problem right now. Currently, my days bring me satisfaction, and I am happy that my life is just beginning. I continue to strive for a bright future full of new opportunities and hopes.